At 10 minutes past 1, on the morning of August 31st, 1997, a telephone rang inside Balmoral Castle. It was not the main line. It was the private line, routed through to the Prince of Wales's bedroom on the first floor of the old granite fortress in the Scottish Highlands. Charles answered it himself. On the other end was the British ambassador to France, Sir Michael Jay, speaking from Paris with a voice that those who heard it later described as carefully controlled. Diana, Princess of Wales, had been in a car accident. She was injured. The extent was unclear. Charles sat on the edge of his bed in the dark and said nothing for several seconds. Then he asked a single question. Was Dodie Fayed also in the car? The answer was yes. He asked to be kept informed, hung up, and did not go back to sleep. Over the next 90 minutes, 2 more calls came. The second told him Diana was in surgery. The third told him she was dead. What happened inside that room between the first call and the third, and what happened in the days that followed, has been the subject of speculation, accusation, and revision for more than a quarter of a century. His critics saw a cold man who could not summon the grief the moment demanded. His defenders saw a father who shielded his sons from the worst night of their lives, with a composure that cost him more than anyone outside that household would ever know. The truth, as it usually does, sits in neither camp entirely. It lives in the small details, the things the staff saw, the words that were spoken when no cameras were present, the private collapse of a man whose marriage had been the most publicly dissected relationship in modern British history. This is the story of what happened when Charles Spencer Windsor, heir to the throne, learned that the woman he had once married, then lost, then been vilified for losing, was gone forever. And it begins not with grief, but with a phone call in the dark. To understand what that night cost Charles, you have to understand what the years before it had already taken. By August 1997, Charles and Diana had been divorced for just over a year. The decree absolute came through on the 28th of August, 1996, almost exactly 1 year to the day before she died. But the marriage had been functionally over for far longer than that. The separation was announced in December 1992, and even that was a formality, acknowledging what the tabloid press and the British public had already concluded. They had stopped pretending sometime around 1986. What remained after the divorce was a careful, sometimes brittle arrangement centred on their 2 sons. William was 15 that summer, Harry was 12. Both were at Balmoral with their father and the Queen when the call came. The boys had arrived in Scotland for their usual summer holiday, and Diana had been due to collect them in a matter of days. The co-parenting arrangement was not warm, but it was functioning. Charles and Diana spoke on the telephone with reasonable regularity about the boys' schedules, their schooling, their well-being. Former staff members have described these calls as businesslike, occasionally terse, but not hostile. The war was over. What replaced it was the particular exhaustion that follows prolonged public conflict, a wary civility between 2 people who had once been on the cover of every magazine in the world and now simply wanted to get through school holidays without incident. Charles's position in the summer of '97 was arguably the lowest point of his public life. The Panorama interview Diana had given in November 1995, watched by nearly 23 million people in Britain alone, had been devastating. Her phrase about there being 3 people in the marriage had entered the language. His long relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, now acknowledged but still deeply controversial, made him a villain in the popular narrative. Polls taken in the mid-90s consistently showed that a significant portion of the British public preferred that the Crown skip Charles entirely and pass directly to William. He was, by most measures, the least popular heir to the throne in modern memory. The institution he was born to lead appeared to regard him as a liability. His mother, the Queen, had handled the divorce with characteristic pragmatism. But there was a distance between them on personal matters that multiple biographers have documented. Charles existed in a peculiar kind of isolation, surrounded by staff, by protocol, by the physical trappings of extraordinary privilege, and yet profoundly alone in the ways that mattered. His relationship with Camilla was real, but had to be conducted largely out of sight. His relationship with his sons was loving, but filtered through the logistics of divorce and the expectations of the institution. His relationship with Diana was civil, but haunted by everything that had been said and done and broadcast. This is the man who picked up the telephone at 1:10 in the morning. Not the caricature the tabloids had built, not the cold prince, not the unfaithful husband, not the man who talked to his plants, but a 48-year-old father of two who had been through a very public divorce and was trying, with limited success, to rebuild his reputation, his household, and his sense of purpose. The call from Paris did not land on a blank surface. It landed on years of accumulated damage, guilt, regret, and the particular British royal conditioning that treats the display of private emotion as a form of institutional failure. Balmoral that summer was staffed by a skeleton crew. The castle operates with a reduced household during the royal family's August holiday, and many of the senior officials who would normally manage a crisis were either in London or on their own leave. The private secretary, Stephen Lamport, was present, as was the Queen's deputy private secretary, Robin Janvrin, who received the initial call from the embassy and then routed information to the relevant parties. It was Janvrin who woke the Queen. It was Lamport who began coordinating with Downing Street, where Tony Blair, only 4 months into his premiership, was informed and immediately began the process that would culminate in his famous People's Princess statement the following morning. Inside Balmoral, in the small hours of that Sunday, a very small number of people knew what had happened, and an even smaller number saw how Charles responded. The first anecdote comes from the immediate aftermath of the confirmed news. Charles had been alone in his room for the duration of the calls. When he finally emerged, shortly before 3 in the morning, he went directly to Stephen Lamport's room. A member of the household staff, whose account was later relayed through the journalist Robert Hardman, recalled seeing the prince walking down the corridor in the dim light. His face was, in the staff member's words, completely white. He did not acknowledge the person he passed. He reached Lamport's door and entered without knocking. Inside, the two men spoke for approximately 20 minutes about logistics, the repatriation of Diana's body, the question of who would fly to Paris, and most immediately, the boys. The staff member who witnessed the corridor walk said afterward that what struck them was not the absence of emotion on Charles's face, but its presence, a kind of rigid, held-together quality that looked, in their description, like a man carrying something physically heavy. The second anecdote concerns the decision about William and Harry. Charles faced a choice that no protocol could guide him through, whether to wake his sons immediately or let them sleep and tell them in the morning. He consulted the Queen, who was awake and had been informed. According to accounts that emerged through royal biographer Penny Junor, the Queen's view was that the boys should be allowed to sleep. There was nothing they could do, and the news would be no less devastating at 7 in the morning than at 3. Charles agreed, though multiple sources describe him as deeply conflicted. A valet who was on duty that night later told a colleague, in an account eventually published, that Charles returned to the corridor outside his son's bedrooms and stood there for several minutes without moving. He placed his hand flat against the door of William's room. He did not open it. He then walked to Harry's door and did the same. Then he went back to his own room. The valet, who watched from the end of the hallway, described it as the most private thing he had ever witnessed, and said he felt ashamed to have seen it. The third anecdote involves the telephone call Charles made to Camilla Parker Bowles. This call is documented by several sources, including biographer Sally Bedell Smith. Charles rang Camilla shortly after 3 in the morning. The conversation lasted approximately 15 minutes. No record of its contents has ever been made public, but Camilla's son, Tom Parker Bowles, later confirmed to a journalist that his mother had been deeply shaken by the call and had stayed awake for the remainder of the night. What this call reveals is the architecture of Charles's emotional life in that period. The person he turned to in genuine crisis was not his mother, not his father, not a sibling, but the woman the public blamed for the collapse of his marriage. The call was an act of emotional honesty in a household built on emotional concealment, and it was made while his ex-wife's body was still in a Paris hospital. The fourth anecdote is the morning itself. Charles woke William and Harry at approximately 7:15. He went to William first, then to Harry. Multiple accounts exist of this moment, though none from the principals themselves. William, who was 15, reportedly understood immediately from his father's face that something was seriously wrong. Charles sat on the edge of the bed and told him. William's reaction, according to a source close to the family, cited by royal correspondent Richard Kay, was silence, followed by a single question. Was it the photographer's fault? Charles did not answer directly. He held his son. When he went to Harry's room, the 12-year-old was still half asleep. Charles delivered the news, and Harry's response, later described by a household source, was immediate and physical. He buried his face in his father's chest and wept. Charles held him for a long time. A member of staff who saw Charles leave Harry's room afterward said the prince's eyes were red and his jaw was set in a way they had never seen before. He walked directly to a bathroom, closed the door, and did not emerge for several minutes. The fifth anecdote takes place at Crathy Kirk, the small church near Balmoral where the royal family attends services during their Scottish holiday. The Queen decided that the family would attend the morning service as planned. This decision would later be criticised as tone-deaf, but within the logic of the institution, it served a purpose. It gave the boys a structure, a reason to dress and move and be somewhere. Charles walked into the church with William and Harry. The minister, Reverend Robert Sloane, had been informed and kept the service brief. A member of the congregation later told a reporter that Charles kept his hand on Harry's shoulder throughout the service. At one point, the boy leaned into his father's side, and Charles shifted his weight to support him without looking down. The congregant, who had attended services at Crathy for decades, said they had never seen any member of the royal family make such an openly protective physical gesture in church. It was small, it was instinctive, and it told a story that contradicted everything the press would spend the next week writing about the cold and absent Windsors. The sixth anecdote concerns the flight to Paris. Charles insisted on going himself to bring Diana's body home. This was not a foregone conclusion. There were voices within the palace apparatus suggesting that a senior courtier could handle the repatriation, that the prince's presence was not strictly necessary and could create logistical complications. Charles overruled them. He flew to Paris on an aircraft of the Royal Squadron on the afternoon of August 31st. When he arrived at the Pitié-Salpêtrière hospital, he was taken to the room where Diana's body lay. The British Consul General, Keith Moss, who was present, later described Charles's composure as extraordinary under the circumstances. He spent approximately 30 minutes alone with Diana. No account of what he said or did in that room has ever been published, and Charles himself has never spoken of it. When he emerged, according to Moss, his face showed nothing. He thanked the hospital staff in French. He was correct and courteous. But Moss noted one detail. When Charles signed the documents required for the repatriation, his hand was not steady. The seventh anecdote involves what happened on the flight home. The coffin was loaded onto the BAE 146 of 32 Squadron at Villacoublay Military Airfield. Charles sat in the cabin with Diana's two sisters, Lady Sarah McCorquodale and Lady Jane Fellows, who had also flown out. The atmosphere on that flight has been described by a crew member in an account published years later as the quietest flight they had ever worked. Charles and Diana's sisters barely spoke. At one point, Lady Sarah broke the silence to say something about Diana's childhood, a fragment of a memory. Charles listened and nodded. He did not add his own. The crew member said that Charles spent most of the flight looking out of the window at nothing, his reflection visible in the glass, and that they had the strong impression the prince was holding himself together by sheer force of will. When the aircraft landed at RAF Northolt, the coffin was received with full ceremony. Charles stood at attention as it was carried past. His face, captured by a single authorized camera, showed the particular blankness of someone who has shut down everything except the ability to stand upright. The eighth anecdote concerns the days at Balmoral before the funeral. The royal family remained in Scotland for several days after Diana's death, and this decision became the focal point of public fury. The press demanded the family return to London. They demanded a flag at half-mast over Buckingham Palace. They demanded visible grief. Charles, by several accounts, was the member of the family who most wanted to return to London immediately. He understood public sentiment in a way his mother, insulated by decades of protocol, did not. A heated discussion took place between Charles and senior palace officials, with the prince arguing forcefully that the family's absence from London was being read as indifference. A staff member who overheard part of this exchange told journalist Robert Lacey that Charles raised his voice, something they had almost never witnessed. He said, in the staff member's recollection, that people were grieving and the family was behaving as though it was a private matter, when it had not been a private matter for 16 years. The Queen, initially resistant, eventually agreed. The return to London was arranged, but it came later than Charles wanted, and the delay cost the monarchy dearly in public goodwill. The ninth anecdote takes place on the night before the funeral. Charles was at Kensington Palace, going through the final arrangements. The funeral had been organised at extraordinary speed, a full ceremonial event planned in 6 days. The question of whether William and Harry should walk behind the coffin had been intensely debated. Charles was initially against it. He did not want his sons subjected to that level of public exposure at a moment of raw grief. It was the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, who reportedly settled the matter by telling William that if the boy walked, he would walk beside him. Charles relented, though a member of his household later said the prince was visibly uncomfortable with the decision. On the night before the funeral, a valet entering Charles's study to deliver papers found the prince sitting in a chair with the lights off. The television was on, showing news coverage of the crowds gathering along the funeral route, the flowers piling up outside Kensington Palace. The valet asked if the prince needed anything. Charles said no, then added, almost to himself, that he had not expected it to feel like this. The valet, uncertain whether the prince meant the public grief or his own, quietly withdrew. The 10th anecdote shifts to the funeral morning, September 6th, 1997. Charles dressed in a dark suit and walked with his sons from the gates of St. James's Palace behind the gun carriage carrying Diana's coffin. The walk was approximately 1 mile, through streets lined with an estimated 3 million people. The silence was, by every account, extraordinary, broken only by the sound of horses' hooves, the creak of the carriage wheels, and intermittent sobbing from the crowd. Charles walked between Philip and Harry. William walked on the other side of Philip. A Metropolitan Police officer positioned along the route later recalled watching Charles's face as he passed. The officer said the prince's expression was set in a way that suggested immense concentration, as though the act of putting one foot in front of the other required his full attention. The officer also noted that Charles periodically glanced to his right, toward Harry, checking on the boy without breaking stride. It was, the officer said, the walk of a man who was simultaneously falling apart and holding 2 children together. The 11th anecdote takes place inside Westminster Abbey. 2,000 people attended the funeral service. Elton John performed a rewritten version of Candle in the Wind. Earl Spencer, Diana's brother, delivered a eulogy that contained pointed criticisms of the royal family, including a veiled reference to the way Diana had been treated by the institution she married into. The congregation applauded the eulogy, an unprecedented sound inside the abbey. Charles sat motionless during the applause. A member of his household seated nearby later described his face as having gone completely still, a kind of shutdown. He did not flinch. He did not react. But his hands, resting on his knees, pressed down hard enough that his knuckles were white. The household member interpreted this as controlled fury rather than grief. The speech had, in their view, been a public attack on the prince at his ex-wife's funeral, and Charles absorbed it without any visible response, because any visible response would have become the story. The discipline required to sit through that applause, in that building, on that day, was something the household member said they thought about for years afterward. The 12th anecdote involves a moment after the service. As the coffin was carried out of the abbey, Charles briefly placed his hand on William's back. A photographer captured the gesture, but it was not widely published at the time, because the image did not fit the dominant narrative of cold and distant royals. A palace aide who was present said that as the family moved into the cars that would follow the hearse to the burial at Althorpe, Charles turned to Harry and said something inaudible to those around them. Harry nodded. The aide believed Charles was asking if the boy was all right, but could not confirm. In the car, away from the cameras, Charles sat with both boys. A protection officer in the vehicle later gave an account, through intermediaries, that Charles put an arm around each son and pulled them close. Neither boy pulled away. The protection officer said the 3 of them sat like that for the duration of the drive, and that it was the first time in his years of service he had seen the prince hold both his children at the same time. The 13th anecdote concerns William's reaction in the days after the funeral. William, at 15, was old enough to read the newspapers and understand the public hostility directed at his father and the wider royal family. A former member of the Balmoral staff, speaking years later, described an incident in which William confronted his father about the media coverage. The teenager asked Charles directly whether the things being written about him were true, whether he had been cruel to Diana, whether he was responsible. Charles, according to this account, did not deflect or give a diplomatic answer. He sat down with his son and spoke to him honestly for what the staff member understood to be more than an hour. The content of that conversation has never been disclosed, but the staff member said William emerged looking older than his years, and that something in the relationship between father and son shifted after that conversation. It was, in their assessment, the moment Charles stopped being a figurehead parent and became a real one. The 14th anecdote comes from the weeks that followed. Charles returned to his official duties relatively quickly, as royal protocol demanded. But his private behaviour changed in ways the household noticed. He began telephoning his sons more frequently, daily rather than every few days. He rearranged his schedule to be present at Eton for William's exeat weekends. A member of his private office later recalled that Charles, who had always been somewhat formal in his interactions with his children, became markedly more physical in his affection. He hugged them in corridors. He put his hand on their heads. The private secretary at the time observed that it was as though Diana's death had given Charles permission to express something he had always felt, but had been conditioned to suppress. The revelation in this shift was not that Charles suddenly loved his sons. No one who knew him privately doubted that, but that he had needed the worst event of his life to override the emotional restraint his upbringing had installed in him. The 15th anecdote takes place months later, at Christmas 1997. The royal family gathered at Sandringham as tradition demanded. A member of the kitchen staff, whose account eventually appeared in a memoir by a former royal employee, described an incident on Christmas evening. After dinner, the family had dispersed. The staff member was clearing a side room and found Charles sitting alone, holding a framed photograph. It was a picture of William and Harry with Diana, taken several years earlier. The staff member attempted to leave without being noticed, but Charles looked up and, apparently without embarrassment, said that she had been a very good mother. The staff member agreed and left. It was, in their recollection, delivered not as a confession or a revelation, but as a simple statement of fact, the kind of honest acknowledgement that the living owe the dead, spoken to someone who did not matter enough in the hierarchy to require performance. The 16th anecdote involves Camilla's role in the aftermath. In the months following Diana's death, Camilla effectively disappeared from Charles's public life. The already slow and carefully managed process of introducing her to the public was suspended entirely. But privately, according to multiple sources, including Tom Bower's biography, Camilla became an essential source of emotional support. She spoke to Charles nightly by telephone. She did not visit Balmoral or any royal residence. She understood, with a political instinct that surprised some who knew her, that her visibility at that moment would be catastrophic. A friend of Camilla's later described this period as the most difficult of her life. She was supporting a man through genuine grief for the loss of a woman the public believed Camilla had wronged, and she could not be seen doing it. The friend said Camilla never expressed resentment about this position, understanding it as the consequence of choices she had made. The restraint she showed in those months, invisible to the public, arguably saved the future of the relationship, and by extension, changed the trajectory of the monarchy. The 17th anecdote is drawn from a later period, but illuminates what the immediate aftermath set in motion. In 2004, 7 years after Diana's death, Charles gave his first extended interview about his personal life. He was asked, indirectly, about the events of August 1997. He did not describe his emotional response. He spoke instead about his sons and their resilience. A journalist present at the taping later wrote that there was a moment, off-camera, when Charles was asked a follow-up about his own feelings that week. He paused for what the journalist described as an uncomfortably long time, perhaps 15 seconds, and then said he did not think it would be useful to discuss that. The journalist interpreted this not as evasion, but as genuine inability. Some doors, once closed, cannot be reopened on command. And the door Charles closed on the morning of August 31st, 1997, appeared to be one of them. The 18th anecdote comes from a conversation reported by a former equerry. Several years after Diana's death, the equerry was accompanying Charles on a visit to a children's hospital. A young girl asked the prince if he had been sad when Princess Diana died. The room went still. The equerry braced for a deflection or a polite platitude. Instead, Charles crouched down to the girl's level and told her yes, he had been very sad. He said it simply, without elaboration, and then asked the girl about her own experience in the hospital. The equerry later said it was the only time he heard Charles directly acknowledge his grief to a stranger, and that it was prompted by a child's question, because a child's question cannot be refused in the way an adult's can. The moment passed without media attention, but the equerry carried it as evidence that the grief was real, present, and carefully contained rather than absent. What does the evidence, taken together, actually tell us? It tells us something more complicated than either the defenders or the critics of Charles have traditionally allowed. The man who received that phone call at 1:10 in the morning was not emotionless. The record, assembled from staff accounts, biographer interviews, protection officers, valets, kitchen workers, crew members, diplomats, and the occasional unguarded moment in Charles's own words, paints a portrait of someone experiencing profound grief through the filter of a lifetime's conditioning. He was raised in a household where emotion was managed, not expressed. He was educated at Gordonston, a school that prized physical endurance over emotional literacy. He was trained from childhood to understand that his feelings were subordinate to his function. None of this is an excuse. It is a context. The criticism that Charles was cold in the days following Diana's death rests on what was visible: the delayed return from Balmoral, the adherence to protocol, the composed face. The defense that he was privately shattered rests on what was not visible: the hand on the bedroom door, the standing in darkened rooms, the unsteady signature in Paris. Neither account is wrong. Both are incomplete. Charles was, in the week of Diana's death, both the institution and the man. And the institution won every public encounter, because that is what it was designed to do. There is a deeper question here, one that extends beyond Charles as an individual. The British monarchy functions on the suppression of private feeling in service of public continuity. The sovereign does not break down. The heir does not weep on camera. The institution endures because its members subordinate their humanity to their role. Diana's great disruption, the thing that made her simultaneously beloved and dangerous, was her refusal to accept this bargain. She felt things publicly. She said things publicly. She cried in public. And the public loved her for it, because it made her recognizable as a human being, in a family that often seemed to exist at a remove from ordinary human experience. Charles's response to her death was, in this light, the monarchy working exactly as intended. He contained his grief. He managed the logistics. He protected his sons as best he could within the constraints he operated under. He flew to Paris. He walked behind the coffin. He sat through the eulogy. And he did all of it with the particular blank composure that the institution demands. The cost of that composure, the standing in corridors at 3 a.m, the hand pressed flat against a child's door, the photograph held alone at Christmas, was paid in private, as the institution requires. Whether this is admirable or tragic depends largely on what you believe a person owes to their role versus what they owe to themselves. Charles appears to have had no difficulty answering that question. The role comes first. It always comes first. The man underneath manages as best he can. If this account has been useful, subscribing to the channel costs nothing, and there are more stories like this one queued. The bell notification means you will see them when they go up. The history of the British monarchy is, at its core, a history of human beings navigating an institution that was not built for human beings. The gap between the public face and the private experience is where the real stories live, and those stories do not end with Diana. They extend forward into Charles's reign, into William's future, into the ongoing negotiation between duty and feeling that defines this family. There are chapters ahead that have not yet been examined, moments of crisis, decision, and private reckoning that the public record only hints at. They deserve the same careful attention, the same commitment to evidence over assumption that this account has attempted to provide. The next one is already in progress. The telephone at Balmoral rang at 1:10 on the morning of August 31st, 1997. Charles answered it, and everything that followed, the white face in the corridor, the hand on the door, the flight to Paris, the walk behind the coffin, the years of rebuilding, flowed from that single moment when the gap between his public role and his private reality became unbridgeable. He did not break in the way the public expected. He did not weep on camera. He did not deliver a trembling statement. He did what he had been trained from birth to do. He carried on. And the people around him, the small number who saw what carrying on actually looked like behind closed doors, understood something the cameras never captured. The composure was not the absence of feeling. It was the container for feeling so overwhelming that releasing it was not an option. Not because he did not want to, but because he did not know how. A lifetime of royal conditioning had given him every tool for managing a crisis and almost none for surviving a grief. He managed the crisis. Whether he survived the grief is a question only he can answer, and he has, characteristically, declined to do so. Diana was 36 when she died. Charles was 48. He is now in his late 70s, king of a realm she once illuminated with a warmth he could never replicate, and never tried to. The photograph the kitchen worker saw him holding at Christmas 1997, the one of Diana with the boys, is not on public display in any royal residence. Its location today is not known, but the fact that he held it alone on a night when the institution required nothing of him and no one was watching tells us what the institution itself never could. He knew what he had lost. He always knew. The tragedy of Charles is not that he did not feel it. The tragedy is that feeling it and showing it were, for a man in his position, two entirely different acts, and he was only ever equipped for one.